The United Kingdom's military capabilities have severely declined over the past few decades, to the point where a senior U.S. general privately told UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace that the UK is no longer seen as a top-tier fighting force. This sparked outrage among the British public until defence analysts explained on news programs that the assessment was accurate. The UK likely could not defend its own territory, let alone help allies. According to one analyst, the UK lacks the ability to counter air attacks it would face during a conflict. This raises the question of how the once formidable British military has decayed to where it can't even protect the homeland. While the armed forces are in a dire state, the government has taken a more forward-thinking stance than its European neighbors regarding the war in Ukraine. Realizing that supporting Ukraine now meant avoiding a potential later war with Russia closer to home, the UK prioritized arming the Ukrainian military despite its own significant equipment shortages. The UK rapidly shipped anti-tank and air defense missiles to Ukraine, while other European countries like France, Germany, Spain and Portugal have been reluctant to provide large quantities of arms, wanting to retain them for their own future defense needs against what is unclear. With Russia struggling in eastern Ukraine, it seems unlikely its military would soon be marching on Madrid. But were the UK forced to directly confront Russia, the outcome would be uncertain given the shocking decline of its military. How did this once elite fighting force, America's most capable Cold War partner, deteriorate to the point Allied soldiers in the Middle East dubbed them the borrowers for their constant lack of proper equipment? Like most of Europe, the UK fell victim to the post-Cold War peace dividend. With the Soviet collapse, Europe assumed Russia would abandon imperial ambitions and reduce military spending could be redirected to other needs. Discussing defense budgets became taboo and political suicide as war was left to the Americans while Europe relied on optimism to repel aggression. Understandably, Europe wanted to forget the Cold War dominating its very doorstep, unlike America where fallout shelter construction signaled an enduring wariness. Europeans were exhausted by conflict and eager to spend lavishly on anything but defense. But allowing the situation to deteriorate until politicians admit the UK has just days of ammunition is criminal. This is just one symptom of a military that by its own admission could not repel an invasion nor meet its NATO commitments. The decline began when the post-Cold War military oriented toward low-intensity conflicts just as the UK was thrust into higher-intensity battles in Iraq and Afghanistan for which it was unprepared. From 2001 to 2010, the wars cost $31 billion even as the 2008 financial crisis hit and the government planned further military cuts to reduce the over 12% budget deficit inherited by Prime Minister Cameron in 2010. Cameron initiated austerity that made realigning defense priorities impossible while a £38 billion military equipment overspend remained. The 2010 Strategic Defense and Security Review effectively gutted the military in line with reduced personnel numbers 102,000 in 2010 down from 220,000 in 1998. The Army shrank 20% from 102,000 to 82,000 personnel. 40% of its Challenger 2 tank fleet was scrapped along with 35% of self-propelled artillery, cheaper to maintain than towed guns retained. The Royal Navy lost HMS Ark Royal, its last aircraft carrier, in 2011. Its Harriers were sold to the U.S. Marine Corps for just $180 million, a bargain given their $2 billion acquisition cost. Lacking carriers or maritime patrol aircraft, Britain relied on allies during the 2011 Libyan intervention. Operation Elemi taxed its stockpile of precision munitions, which remain unreplaced. Further cuts continued despite leadership warnings about readiness. A promised 1% budget increase from 2015-2020 offered false hope, as did a 5% increase pledge from 2020-2021, quickly undermined by Brexit and the COVID pandemic. But in 2020, Boris Johnson announced the largest UK military funding boost since the Cold War, a four-year $21.9 billion budget rise for rearmament and replenishment. However, plans remain to cut the size of ground forces and armor. Russia's 2022 Ukraine invasion shocked Europe and forced increased spending, but economic disruption strained budgets further even as the UK provided Ukraine with $2.8 billion in aid, hundreds of armored vehicles and 10,000 artillery rounds. The core issue is the inability to replace equipment sent to Ukraine, causing the warning that the UK military could only fight for 5 days. So how could Britain support allies in a World War III scenario? For decades, Britain assumed its role in future conflicts would be primarily air and naval, enabling massive army and armor cuts. The Army's Challenger 2 tank fleet is down to 213 from 407 in the 1990s, and is being reduced to 148 upgraded Challenger 3s by 2030 rather than expanded. With typical 75% readiness rates, around 100 will be available during peacetime. Even moderately high loss rates seen in Ukraine would eliminate them within months. Infantry fighting vehicles face similar cuts as the Warrior is replaced by the Ajax. Plans are to acquire just 589 Ajax by 2029 compared to today's 721 Warriors. Artillery relies on just 126,105 mm towed howitzers and 89,155 mm as 90 self-propelled guns after sending 32 as 90s to Ukraine. These are being replaced by highly mobile but lightly armored Swedish Archer systems. Total tube artillery numbers just 44. Apache attack helicopters will rise from 44 to 50 as aging airframes are replaced. The legendary Royal Navy has endured cuts as well. Its nuclear deterrent stands at 4 ballistic missile submarines plus 6 aging attack subs. The Trafalgar class is being retired and replaced by the newer Astute Class 7 are planned, but more may be needed to counter China. However, long shipbuilding timelines mean new subs may arrive too late. The Queen Elizabeth class has restored Britain's carrier aviation capability, but the two vessels' maximum 36 F-35s each falls far short of a U.S. supercarrier's 75-90 jets. The F-35 allows Britain to punch above its weight, but industrial espionage by a British pilot sharing secrets with China has frayed UK-US ties. Just 6 air defense destroyers and 11 lightly armed frigates lacking major surface combat power escort the carriers, leaving anti-ship duties to the submarine force. The RAF is also in crisis, having just 137 Typhoons and 29 F-35s. The F-35 fleet is split with the Navy. Typhoons are already being retired before their Tempest replacement is ready, likely leaving the RAF with well under 200 combat aircraft when attrition is factored in. Its lack of early warning aircraft until 2024 and shortage of supporting assets has drawn criticism. 9 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft remain to patrol the crucial GI-UK gap. In a major European war, Britain would serve a supporting role far removed from its frontline efforts in the world wars. Its main NATO contribution would be providing its territory for basing American long-range strike aircraft. With no bombers of its own and limited air power, its fighters would be best utilized securing airspace over Britain and the Atlantic. The Royal Navy would focus on keeping the GI-UK gap closed to Russian ships and submarines. Britain would struggle to provide substantial ground and air firepower to NATO. Its land forces would likely serve as a reserve to reinforce and relieve depleted allies as it slowly mobilizes, while lacking firepower for a frontline role. In a Pacific conflict, Britain would aid the US and Australia but be even more limited. The recent UK-Japan defense agreement does allow military basing, so British air and ground forces could help defend Japan. Submarines would threaten Chinese shipping, and a carrier group could boost strained U.S. naval resources, but only one carrier would likely be available. No longer a global military power, Britain retains capabilities to aid allies significantly if in supporting roles. However, it has become dangerously over-reliant on its nuclear deterrent and allies to guarantee its security after inadequate investment left its conventional forces hollowed out. With defense revival programs still in their infancy, Britain may struggle to even play a major supporting role if faced with a major conflict in the near future.